It's the Church of Jesus Christ
the American people are so fearful of the government, and they forgot to be fearful of God.
The more money the government prints in order to cover its tracks and its mistakes and its overspending, the less the money can buy, and that's called inflation.
Today, the inflation rate in America tops the list of economic concerns among Americans, according to recent surveys.
I think inflation is a really big issue. One of the problems with inflation is your value of your dollar or the value of whatever currency you have drops precipitously. You can talk about the inflation rate that we're dealing with right now, but oftentimes on my radio show I hold up a particular bill that comes from Zimbabwe of $100 trillion note in Zimbabwe. There was a time in Zimbabwe where a Zimbabwe dollar was worth about a US dollar, no longer.
The problem is the more money that you create, of course, the value goes down because the more there is in circulation.
The current inflation that we're seeing in our nation is really the result of printing money and throwing it out into people's hands. During the pandemic, we were paying people to stay home. And there was that time period that as jobs opened back up and people were able to work and find work again, they would make more money by sitting at home.
Anybody with any sense would have seen this as an inflationary public policy, and we're going to see really bad inflation. That's exactly what happened.
Some have called inflation the cruelest tax of all because an artificial increase in the money supply is actually a type of government oppression that has a greater effect the less you earn. It also redistributes wealth from people who rely on salaries to people who live off assets.
It affects people that have a fixed income, or if they're middle income or lower income, because if you think about that, inflation affects things like your food, your energy, and your actual shelters and things of that nature.
There is a Christian perspective on inflation, and it goes back actually long before Christ, who simply amplified and reinforced what we learned from the Old Testament, which is that any attempt by government or other people to falsify weights and measures, to degrade the value of a currency, is a sin. The Israelites were condemned by the prophet Isaiah in the Old Testament by the following admonition. He said, "Thy silver has become dross, thy wine mixed with water." And what he was saying was, you've cheapened your currency. You've mixed in cheaper junk metals, as has been the case in so many societies in history. That's a kind of inflation. We do it differently today with our printing presses and credit expansion, but it's the same process.
Anytime I hear the government say, we're going to help you, we're going to give you money, you know, they're doing it for them, not for you. They're not trying to help you. They're trying to help them. They're trying to be popular with you by giving you something. That's why we are where we are.
The good news is that inflation is really good for the government because then they can pay off future debts with devalued dollars. It's really good for people that are really in debt because they can pay off future debts with devalued dollars. So there are individuals that actually want to tell you that inflation is good for you. It's not, and it's not good for the country, it's not good for the individual. And then you have some individuals that have kind of this mindset that, well, if indeed the gas that you're going to be buying at the gas pump is going to be too expensive, well, then you just go buy a Tesla. You know, spend $110,000 on an electric car.
As the left continues to increase government spending, what they're not telling you is that the need to pay these obligations of the federal government is another factor that usually drives inflation.
So we have to understand that their destruction of the American economy, they're causing inflation to spike and gas prices to spike and all this kind of stuff. Not only is it the result of what they do, but it has become their intention, because if you can cripple an economy in the way that they have been doing, you can get people dependent on the government. You cannot do that if the government, if the economy is thriving. So by crippling the economy, they have made more and more people dependent on the government in various ways.
What we must understand is that if a government wants to have authority and power, it needs people who are dependent upon the government. Because if you're dependent upon the government, that means that the government then has power and authority over you. So the more people it can make dependent, the more powerful the government becomes, because after all, you need the government in order to live.
So this is actually a game plan. And it's another reason when people say, like, well, I don't want to be political. If one party is working overtime to destroy the fabric of American life and to destroy the economy in such a way that it is making people less free, how do you not get involved in that? Your faith should compel you to get involved in that, because real human beings are going to suffer if you don't.
The American people are so fearful of the government, and they forgot to be fearful of God. They also somehow move their focus from God to government, believing that the government is the provider and not God. God of the universe is saying, I know you are limited, but I'm powerful. Come and work with me. That's our God, and that's who we can be in Christ.